while you're formulating your questions, with one for Mark, and that's, what word of encouragement or challenge, you may lean in one or the other direction, would you give to somebody here who's listened to these talks, is agreeing with it, and having a little bit of panic to think, this is so much not how our church is operating, and maybe frame your response both to someone who's in church leadership and can do something about it, and somebody who's looking, oh, I wish my church were like this, and it's not.
I think to either one, my answer would basically be, try to get down into words 2 or 3 points that you're particularly concerned about. Maybe you have scripture behind that. Think about it well yourself. And then go to a couple of leaders at your church, whether you're not a leader or whether you are. Either way, go to a couple of leaders or a couple of other leaders at your church and see if they agree with you. And just start there.
Okay. The floor is open. Questions? Yeah, if you can come to a mic.
So Trudy, Judy from?
I'm from Jackson, south of Jackson.
In which church?
Grace Church in Jackson.
Okay.
I had to deal with several issues on this, and I used 9 marks here, discipline specifically, to help me through the issues. One was that they didn't believe in discipline. And so coming from a truly Reformed church, moving here, didn't have that background. Some of the truly Reformed church believed in discipline, going into a church who didn't even know anything about it. So I've been through the gambit of Matthew 18 is my big thing on how, to me, to maintain relationships is so important, both between the Lord but between people. And Matthew 18, he provided that to help us maintain good relationships. And what I learned is a good relationship is maintained even when you have to separate because of sin. That's still, because it would be a bad relationship to stay with someone who has living in grievous sin. So anyway, what happened was, this is my question. What I'm finding is sometimes pastors believe that they're above Matthew 18, where they allow people, when a conflict happens, they don't come to one another and try to resolve that issue to maintain that relationship, but they'll run to the pastor. The pastor then will listen to one person's side without saying, wait, have you gone to that person yet? He'll listen to the whole story, even make a judgment against that other person because he hasn't even heard them yet. So, and I'm speaking from experience. So my question or my concern is pastors cannot be above Matthew 18. If he wants to save himself a lot of trouble, he'll just say, you know what, you need to go to that person first and work it out. Because when someone comes to the pastor first, that relationship's destroyed because they haven't gone through the process that Matthew 18 wants you to go through. But not only that, and so that's what I'm experiencing. I've actually had a pastor tell me, well, I'm a pastor of the church. I thought I should listen to it.
So Mark, how would you counsel parishioners, pastors, as they have concerns? Is it proper to come to a pastor first? Does the pastor ever listen to something? Not knowing the specifics of this situation, but in general.
I think Judy's basically right. I mean, there might be some variations depending on the specifics, but if you have a concern, you should go and speak to that person directly. Now, where I will put a little proviso on that, Judy, if let's say that Kevin and I are in the same church, and he has a concern about me, and he sincerely loves me, but he just has a concern, but he genuinely doesn't know how to approach me about it. Well, I think it's fine if he goes and talks to a pastor about that. Now, his goal needs to be in then being able to come and speak to me about it directly. But I think even that allowance could be abused, so I'd want to be very careful with that. But I know, like when my wife and I first got married, I said, honey, you talk to anybody you want about me and say anything you want. Because I trust you, I love you, you're going to need help in dealing with me, I'm a sinner. So get help, and God bless you. Yeah. And thanks so much for marrying me, So, and it's worked real well.
So But what I found is, in my experience, is that a lot of times there's a couple of reasons why they won't go to the person directly. One, that they're not concerned with reconciliation. Two, it's probably not the truth because they don't want to face them because they know it's not true. And or third, even if they did ask for forgiveness, they wouldn't do it. So all those reasons are not good reasons. And as a pastor, you have to be aware of that and send them back before they even explain it, I think. And then one last challenge, even if it's your pastor's wife, that's what's hard for you guys. A pastor's wife may hear it and then, or she may have an offense, say with me, she needs to come to me too rather than, just work it out. Because if I find out that you went to the pastor and told him, the odds or the chances of our relationship being restored goes down with every person you have to draw into the conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was going to say, just a follow-up. There's a good book we're reading as a staff by Matthew Mitchell on gossip, which is just a helpful, just biblical study on gossip, and it's been good discussion for our staff to talk about. It just hits on some of those issues because in ministry you hear lots of things, and that's part of it, but we also have to abide by the same commands. So thank you. Other questions?
Go backwards. My name is Brian. I'm associate pastor at Rothbury Community Church, which is a community church, which means we're not part of a denomination or anything like that. I'm curious what you would say.
Brian?
Brian, yes.
Do you baptize babies?
No.
I guess you're a Baptist church then.
Yes, basically. That's true.
Mark has sort of papal authority. He just likes to claim whomever he can.
It's a mere matter of
Well, he's got
definition.
categories, everyone.
Cladistics, really. Yeah.
So I'm interested in what would you say a church's responsibility is in a fellowshipping with other churches, whether it be locally or geographically or even nationally. What building up that kind of relationships, as we don't have a natural means to do that as we're not part of a denomination.
Kevin does auxiliary bishop work for all kinds of people, even in churches like your own, I think. So you're welcome to apply to His Eminence for time in the schedule. I don't think you have a responsibility that's analogous to you as an individual Christian needing to be a member of a local church. Mm-hmm. That, I think, is hardwired into the New Testament. What you're talking about is more, I think, prudent and appropriate. And we see exampled in the New Testament with Paul's concern that he's raising money for the churches that are suffering back in Judea. Yep. So the Corinthian church expresses concern there. So I would just think it's a prudent thing to want to have fellowship with other churches in your area who you think you would have things in common with. Part of it depends on what you want to do together. So we won't church plant with our PCA friends in the area, but we will do evangelistic things with them. We have evangelistic talks, at Georgetown Law School. We've done it in the Capitol, and we'll do that with an Anglican church, a Presbyterian church, and us, because those are two that we would actually trust more than we trust most of the Baptist churches around when it comes to theology of core matters. Yeah. But when it comes to church planting, well, then we're going to work with some of the Baptist churches. So it just depends on what it's together for. If it's pastoral fellowship, then you'd want to find guys who have a pretty large agreement with you theologically, though not entire. I can have better pastoral fellowship with Kevin than I can with probably most Baptist pastors I know, because there's just so much that we agree on, and so much of that is so important. And the disagreements that we have, they're 500 years old. So we think we kind of understand where the lay of the land is on that, and we got it. It's not important. It's just like, it's a done deal, and we're both sorry it's there, but it's an imperfect world, But the things that are kind of living and moving right now, I would tend to have the same instinctual response Kevin would to pretty much all of them. So when you find guys like that, that's who you're going to have really good fellowship with, I think.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Giving the other microphone some airtime, that's good.
Thanks. My name is John. I'm from Graham Community Church, about 10 miles northeast of here.
Community church?
Graham Community Church. Further questions can go to my pastor over there. Last night we all sang, "The church on earth hath union with God the three in one, and mystic sweet communion with those whose rest is one." What is that mystic sweet communion with those whose rest is one, and under which of the 9 marks does it fall?
Well, brother, I don't think it falls under any of the 9 marks. The 9 marks are not a complete ecclesiology in any way whatsoever. That's just, it's like a prescription from a doctor about here are 9 medicines that might help. So it's not a complete ecclesiology, it's not meant to be.
Let me rephrase it then. What does it look like in your church when you practice the mystic sweet communion with those whose rest is one?
I think it means that we follow Christ. We have the Lord's Supper. We sing his praises. We participate in the same, let's use New Testament language, we participate in God's own life by the Spirit's indwelling that they have participated in, and that in another sense they do participate in. They come into our minds, more specifically at the Lord's table. When after we take the Lord's Supper, I pray for the Lord's return and thank God for those who have gone before, who are with whom we are joining when we take the Lord's Supper. Yeah.
Yes?
You need to go into the microphone. Yeah. Others, you can form lines. I mean, just, if you're
yes.
dying with questions, just form lines. Just stream down.
The buses will wait.
That's right.
Yes.
Hey, I'm Jay. I'm a pastor at Grace Baptist Church in Hamtramck, and it's kind of a follow-up question to the one earlier. What part does the covenant play in your church's life? Is it something that's vital to your church, that people know it well, and it means something to them, such that if they deviate from the covenant, that's something that should kind of raise people's eyebrows?
The covenant is not a highly specific document of many pages with lots of delineated. It's one page.
Right.
It's a revision of the first covenant that the church made together when they were founded in February of 1878. It's subscribed to by all people joining the church. When I came, they didn't know they had one, and I found their original one in a frame leaning against the wall behind the furnace. So I pulled it out and said, "Hey guys, look what this is." And they said, "Well, what's that?" And I said, "Well, it's this, and it functions like this." And so we started using it again. I brought it up at a members' meeting that I wanted us to start reciting the covenant again, reading it, taking it together before the Lord's Supper each time. And when I said that, Jessie Trainham, who was then 88, Jessie put her hands up and she said, "Well, I can remember when we used to do that in my church when I was a girl." And I said, "Yeah, Jessie, I told you, I have no new ideas. I'm a delegate from your great-grandparents. I've just come back." And so all this new stuff we're doing, so the church covenant is something you would affirm before you would join the church in order to join the church. So that was a little controversial when I started saying things like that. When I wanted to do membership interviews and use the church covenant as a kind of filter. But, in God's providence, once again, I was looking around in our church archives, always helpful, and I found a membership application form from January of 1895. And it was almost exactly like the ones we were using. And I found it in December of 94. So in our January 1995 newsletter, I just reproduced that 1895 January application for membership. And I just said, that's what they were doing 100 years ago. It's exactly what I'm talking about now. Let's use the church covenant. And people agree they want to live like this in the statement of faith. They believe this. And we join together. So what we do, now our church used to, in the 1870s and 1880s, they would have a covenant meeting the Thursday night before they'd be taking the Lord's Supper on Sunday morning. Because we don't take the Lord's Supper every week. We do it once a month. But what we are doing now, and what we recovered when I got there, was beginning to use the covenant at the Lord's table. So we would say, if you're visiting with us tonight, we're very glad to have you. But if you're a member of this local congregation, would you please stand? And then we take the Lord's covenant again together, or the church covenant. Okay. And it's very useful.
Okay, you find that your body is something they know and they want to understand?
Yeah.
Okay. I have one follow-up question for a friend who was told by a pastor.
Yeah, for a friend.
Yeah, for a friend.
This is where we find out what the brother's real concern is, Kevin.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they were told by a pastor, the only reason you should ever leave a church is either if you're sent out, or if you die, or if you're disciplined out of the church. Those are the only 3 reasons why you would ever...
I couldn't disagree more. I just don't agree with that at all.
So give us some of the other reasons.
You think you're going to grow more spiritually. So I tell, I have people all the time saying, I want to go to this church, I want to go to that church. And, I know them, they're talking to me about it, I probably know them. I'm going to just try to explore why. Now, if I think there's a difficult relationship they're trying to avoid, if I think there's a doctrine that they're struggling with, if there's a sin that they're not dealing with, all of those things I would try to explore. But if it's just like they innocently think that they moved over here, they're closer to this church, or they've heard that preacher, they like that preacher, or they have friends going there, they think they'll plug in better there, and it's an Orthodox place, I am happy for them to go. God bless them. Bless the ministry of that church. If you want to come back, you're welcome back.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. So like tomorrow night, there'll be, I don't know, probably 10 people leaving our church, joining other local churches. And we are deeply okay with that.
Good.
And we will be praying for all those local churches, praying for God to bless their ministry.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Vanessa. I'm a member here at URC. So my question is, how would you counsel someone or respond to someone who has a hard time with membership and would say, I've been faithfully attending a church for 10, 15 years. I give my offering to that church. My friends go here. I go to the Bible study. I'm very involved, but I don't want to be a member.
Vanessa, that would get very personal very quickly. I would just ask them why.
Vanessa's a very dear person in our church.
Yeah, I mean, maybe with background of being a member and being in leadership and having that go poorly, or I just feel like it's not important. I'm already connected to everyone here, so how does membership really help me? If they think, even some of the things that you said earlier this morning of like having people around you to encourage and rebuke and teach, if they think they're already getting that in the church without being a member, what's the benefit to being a member?
Good thought.
Well, first of all, I would wonder what poor practices, my church has if I've let people get very connected who aren't members. So I would try to make it a little more uncomfortable for non-members. So I'm not going to be letting them lead in music. I'm not going to be letting them lead a small group.
Amen.
I'm not going to be letting them in a small group.
Amen.
I'm not going to let them serve in any way. I'm going to want to funnel it that they can attend the public services. And of course, privately, they can have friendships with whoever they want to, and that's their own business, of course. But as much as possible, because I love their soul, I'm going to want to make it hard for them. I want them to, because I want them to come to our membership stuff. Ben was telling me he's got a 12-week membership classes here. It's going to be good stuff for your Christian life. I want them to sit through that. Then I want to have an interview with them. I want to hear their testimony. Maybe they're confused about what it means to be a Christian. Maybe, and Kevin's a physician of the soul. The elders are physicians of the soul. That's what they're called to do. So to comb through their testimony and then talk to them about their understanding of the gospel, all of this they're rejecting by not being a member. If this church they're going to teaches this clearly, it's arrogance on their part. I might have personal sympathy if they have a difficult background with something that happened, but for that as an argument, I have no respect for it. And even if they are such a strong Christian that they don't need it, well, good for them. There are a lot of people not quite as strong as you are who might be helped by having a more formal commitment. So maybe if they would condescend to think of others who are weaker than they are, they might be a good example and try to help some weaker people. So Vanessa, I think pretty strongly about this.
Vanessa is a member of a church.
She said she was, and I believed her. But I just think
Our church.
I think we might not realize that as charitable as all this stuff can sound, and we don't say anything about it, it's not a kind thing. It's not a kind thing to confuse sheep. It's not a kind thing at all. So I don't have to think their motivations are bad or their intentions are bad, and I don't want to besmirch those. But I do, as a doctor, as an elder, I do want to make it clear how serious that illness is. If the sheep are beginning to decide, well, they don't really need to be members. Lots of implications about that. And it will not be helpful to them or to anybody.
Thanks, Vanessa.
I assume no one wants to ask questions now.
My name is David Booth, and I'm a missionary to Portugal, and my question is in regard to church discipline. There are some things that are pretty obvious, for example.
David, have you heard of Fiel?
Yes. I went to their conference this past year.
Rick Denham, you know who Rick is?
Not personally.
He founded Fiel. He's the guy who runs it.
I see.
Do
Well,
you know
it's a
any of their
tremendous
missionaries,
ministry.
and are you in Lisbon?
That's right, I am.
Do you know any?
He's an intern in our church right now.
Oh, wow, terrific.
So, yeah, anyway.
Well,
Go
they're a
ahead.
great ministry.
So I would love to get your name. So Charles, if you can get your name and contact info, I'd love to put him together with Rick.
Great.
Yeah.
There are some issues that are more obvious, for example, adultery or fraud or whatever. But what about sins that are more difficult to peg? For example, like a divisive spirit or somebody that's rebellious against leadership. These are emotions or not that are not as clearly defined as, for
Yeah.
example, adultery. How do you handle that? Do you practice church discipline for somebody that is divisive, or do you just kind of overlook that and let it go?
Yeah.
And throw into that what you mentioned earlier, someone who just doesn't attend anymore. Do you finally excommunicate someone after much discussion who doesn't go to church?
We do excommunicate those people, and we do excommunicate the divisive.
How?
But let me say that church excommunication shouldn't be viewed as like the capital punishment of church discipline. It's not like, and for the most serious infractions, we have excommunication. You know, you need to think of it more like a doctor. It's a medicine, and it has a limited scope that it's useful for. So the pride in your soul may be even more serious than an adulterous relationship, or your greed, by its very difficult, slippery nature to define, may be more dangerous for you than a single case of fraud. But those things are not as simply and cleanly gotten after. So church, you can't use that final stage of excommunication for any sin, by which I mean for whatever sin one might name. It doesn't work like that. I think for church discipline to work, you have to have either the facts of the case undisputed, or at least being so overwhelmingly clear that it would cause, that the facts of the case would cause no division in your congregation. Now, or in your eldership, if your eldership is the body that would finally take the action. Now, if the facts are clear, then I would allow for there to be some difference over what the congregation or what the eldership thinks should be done, and still act. So the divisiveness I'm concerned about is not that 40% think you should not excommunicate somebody for joining the Roman Catholic Church, and 60% of you think you should. Well, I'm fine with that. Then you excommunicate, and the 40% can learn. My concern is if you're disagreeing over what the facts are and you think each other's gotten that wrong, you can't proceed with that. So there are a lot of pride, greed. You can't go anywhere with that. Divisiveness is a particularly dangerous one. It's about the lowest on the demonstrable level you can get and still need to do it. And there have been, I can remember 2 times in the last 20 years where we have excommunicated for divisiveness. But you really don't want to do that because it can look like the leadership not liking criticism. And that just, all the weakest sheep, the ones most apt to conspiracy theories, the ones most easily feel personally rejected, feel you're getting at them, all the sheep you should care most for are the ones who are most easily deluded. And we'll start thinking, oh, the elders are against us. Oh, we can't trust the elder. And that's just not worth it. You don't want that. You love those sheep. So you've got to be very careful when it gets to divisiveness. So by God's grace, the 2 times we have done it, sadly, the people who have become very divisive have made that obvious to the whole congregation by their actions. And if we were going to have any trouble in going forward with it, the very things they themselves did, like this one couple a few years ago, they entered in like 900 email addresses because they didn't know how to do lists. They were older. And they entered in these 900 email addresses and sent this 38-page single-spaced letter to everybody in our church. So we knew they were a problem before that was getting really clear. But when all of a sudden this letter goes out and I start getting phone calls, I realized, well, this is done. There'll be no problem now at the members' meeting because this couple has just really presented all the reasons we would give and more, why they should be excommunicated. So, yeah, you want to have an eye to the congregation being able to sustain the discipline that you would enact.
Ryan?
Yep, Ryan White, pastor at First Baptist Church of Stanton, Michigan. I read Chris Bronze's book on unpacking forgiveness, and we've been trying to put those practices into place. And my question is, when we've had to facilitate and work through conflict resolution and taking the time to do that properly and prayerfully, on the backside, on the end of that, encouraging people to establish right relationships again with one another. It was like, well, we'll do the Heisman, we'll just keep you at arm's length and not, we'll be polite, but there's really no restored relationship. What are some steps practically that we can do, and would you discipline for someone who's not going to follow biblical pattern and reestablish relationship with someone whom they have forgiven after repentance?
Yeah, almost certainly not. I mean, that would just be so vague. I don't know how. I mean, I don't know how I define my relationship with Kevin, and so to restore it, I wouldn't. There's no way you could use church discipline for someone like that.
And what,
That I see. I mean, you might see a way to do it, but I couldn't see one.
and how following forgiveness, I mean, there's some kind of spectrum of, okay, you've said you're forgiven,
Right.
but there's so clearly an animosity that it just seems to be a name only, versus you've forgiven, and the betrayal was so deep and the hurt that to say you need to trust and you need to have the exact same relationship, that's not what we would say as pastors, I don't think, to someone.
Well, I think
So
you
how-
would
how do
pray
you-
for that and you'd want that. But
Yeah.
no, you wouldn't be surprised when that doesn't happen. But Brian, you seem to think it's sin every time that doesn't happen.
The relationship doesn't.
So you wouldn't think that a spouse who's been cheated upon, who doesn't feel he or she can follow the example of Hosea, you wouldn't feel that spouse has any right to divorce.
Well, don't use divorce. Use a different.
Well, no, I think divorce is an excellent
Okay.
example.
Just saying, then you get into the divorce issue.
Yeah, Ryan, if I understood your question, we are in sin if we do not forgive when we're sinned against. And that forgiveness needs to entail regarding that other person with no less anything than we did before we were sinned against. Or else it's not true forgiveness.
I would say that forgiveness is contingent on repentance,
Right.
just like in the model of God's forgiveness.
I agree entirely. So yeah, so there's real repentance and. Okay, so then that's my question then. So you would say that a spouse who has been, their spouse has been unfaithful to them, and they come back, you would say that the spouse who's been faithful cannot forgive them unless they refuse to divorce them. Okay. Well, then I would just say by analogy, in other relationships, there can be a time when you don't restore them to exactly the same status, but you genuinely have forgiven them. And I would use that as an analogy.
Yeah. I mean, on different scale, parents who find out a child had been abused or something, there would be forgiveness, and that to expect the relationship, if it was somebody they knew, to continue in exactly the same way is probably not going to happen.
Chris Brown says that not all the parameters, and also
Yeah.
that not all the consequences are removed.
Right. That's a good way to put it.
The people in the back can't hear.
Not all the consequences are removed. So the thief on the cross could be forgiven. He still faced some civil consequences. Next, Ryan.
Yeah. Ryan Potter, College Church in Wheaton. When somebody's going through the process of excommunication, they've been excommunicated, how do you advise the members of the congregation what their relationship to that person should look like practically? And does that change, friend to friend, that might look one way, does that change if it's a sibling, a parent who's been excommunicated? What does that relationship look like?
I think we have a little realm of prudence in answering this question, because if you just literally write down all of, well, Jesus in Matthew 18, Paul all the other times, the phrases that are used to describe how such a person is regarded, they're not all the same thing. So, Gentile and tax collector. But don't treat him as an enemy, treat him as a brother, Paul says to the Thessalonians. And then expel him. So it seems like it varies a little. I think the thing that would be unchanging throughout it is that you don't want to casually treat them as if they're a believer. So I don't think it means if your parents have been excommunicated that you don't have Thanksgiving dinner with them. I think you still, and you treat them as your parents, as a matter of the family, but you don't pretend around them anymore that you think they're Christians. You're not shy about that. In fact, you want to draw to their attention. And if it's not family, if it's just friendships, then I think it seriously curtails the friendship. As long as they claim to be following Christ and really lying about it by saying, hey, I can keep living with my father's widow. Like the guy in 1 Corinthians 5. They can't do it. They won't inherit the kingdom of God, and they're deceiving other people by making that claim. They need to turn loose of their claim to follow Jesus, or they need to turn loose of their sin. And your relationship is one means of them helping to see that. So you don't relate to them casually like nothing's gone on.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Wallace Butts, Fort Wayne Love Church. Question about discipline. What kinds of things have you seen churches get into legally as they go through this process of discipline with families?
I remember reading about the suicide counseling case at MacArthur's church back in the 80s, maybe, or early 90s. I remember reading about some Christian church in Oklahoma, but I've never personally known any church that's gotten in any trouble over this. So it may exist out there somewhere. I know it's every pastor's fear. And some of you here may have, or you may have known of some. But it's just, I can think of those couple of examples, and I'm sure there are others, but I don't personally know of them.
Yeah, I think, two things that we've tried to do, I don't know if it gets exactly to the question, but we have, so the first one was with a counseling situation. The person ended up committing suicide and felt like, we have excellent biblical counselor here, does a fine job, trains up people, do a good job, but we want to make clear to people this is not a state licensed counseling. Just if that, people need to know that so they don't come in with the wrong sort of expectations or pretenses. I think that's how churches can get in trouble. I know a church right now that may be facing a defamation lawsuit from somebody who experienced a form of church discipline, and as they've talked to lawyers, the lawyers have said, that's really hard to nail a church on if you're telling the truth. Mm-hmm. So the guy would say, well, you've ruined my reputation, and at least what they're hearing from legal counsel is, if what you're saying actually happened, then the courts, at least for the meantime, don't tend to weigh in. So I think there are a lot of fears, and if churches are wise, I'm like you, I haven't heard of churches getting sued for defamation because they did church discipline. Again, but if they have a process, they have to follow that and be truthful.
I do think as the culture changes, if the culture does change to regard Bible-believing Christianity with more hostility, which I think is likely but not certain, if that does continue to happen, I think we will find the courts feeling much less restrained in using their coercive power against Christians in whatever way they can. But like Kevin, by God's grace in America, we're not at that point yet, from what I can tell. But I think we're much closer to it than we were 10 years ago.
Taylor DeShago here, University Reformed Church. Kind of have a two-pronged question. The first would be, what is your advice to college students who, say, come to Michigan State University, start attending URC, getting involved in college ministry? What would be your advice to them on pursuing church membership? And then the second, kind of coming off of what Vanessa Cheeseborough had said about maybe a student or somebody you know who is isn't very involved in the church, doesn't think they need church membership. I feel like with college ministry it's very tricky because they're getting things like Bible studies and being ministered to by the body. So how do you navigate that? What's your advice to college students?
It's a great question. We're not built around college ministry, maybe as much as you guys are. We're not right next to a campus. But we probably have 50 to 100 undergrads with us on a Sunday morning, so it's a significant thing. We don't have a standard line on college students. we would tell them where you basically are is where you need to be a member. And so for some of them, that's going to be away at college, and that's great. We're happy for them to do that. For some of them, that's going to be with us if they really are home all the vacations and they really haven't moved and they're just there for classes and they're always back here. But even if that's the case, if they were to leave their membership with us as their home church, we would want them to identify themselves to a pastor and be at a particular church while they're in university. And probably more normally actually just join that church during those years. So we would just have a lot of flex on that. And we would want to make sure that there are Bible studies available for college students, regardless of whether or not they're members.
Okay.
So a lot of our rules would go out the window for college students just because it's such an unusually split time of life for so many people. Now, honestly, if we had a 20-year-old who was going to a university in D.C. and they'd been brought up in our church or they'd been brought up in D.C., their family's there, we would think a little bit differently about that. There wouldn't be the split. There would be for students that are traveling from elsewhere.
So would you say you would want to encourage those students then who are involved in Bible studies and in the college ministry to pursue membership while they're here if they're, say, from across the country and they're here for their 4 years?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the basic principle is that where a Christian lives, they need to, in humility, be a member of a local church. So the only reason college students are a special question is where do they live? You know, I mean, I was in Cambridge for 6.5 years, and we had 300 undergrads, but they're only there for 8 weeks, 8 weeks, and 8 weeks. They have long vacs in between, and the really long vac in the summer, and so it just, you know, they were there half the year, maybe not quite. So then there was just questions, well, should they be back in their church in Wales, where they're from, or should it be, you know, here?
But you're not opposed to college students or encouraging college students to join a church.
I think it's usually better they join a church where their college is, because I think usually most college students, if it's a residential college like Michigan State, they're moving there and living there. I think they at least want to identify a particular church and identify themselves to that church, but more normally they probably want to just go ahead and join that church.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Taylor. Adele?
Hi, I'm Adele. I'm from URC. And this morning you talk about like how important it is to be a member of the local church. But like for me, I know a lot of my friends, they are in China, in some area of China. They just cannot find a good church, or even they cannot find a church. Mm-hmm. So what's your suggestions to this situation?
Pray, send more workers, plant churches.
Would you want Adele's friends there to, I think you wouldn't want them to feel a sense of guilt or shame or burden if they can't find it.
Well, maybe burden.
But
not guilt and
yes.
shame. No, I mean, it depends on their situation. I mean, if they could have taken a job someplace else where there would have been a church, or if they can be more proactive in helping to start a church where they've gone.
But if in the process, like, there's really no church, but we pray, maybe it's in the process, it's building or something, will you prefer them to join the bad church or just stay at home, study Bible?
It just depends on the situation. We've got, of our 6 interns, 2 are from Shanghai right now. So, you know, I've talked to them a good bit about situations they're facing back in China. And it just varies very much on what the local government enforcement is like, what the 3 self-churches are like. Yeah. You know, if there are underground churches. I mean, it varies. But I certainly wouldn't think it was by definition wrong for somebody to put themselves in that position where there is no church for them to be a member of. I think it's dangerous, but it may be the thing they have to do. And then you just pray for them. And you want to see a church started where they are.
Okay, thank you.
Lucy.
Hi, I'm Lucy. I've been URC for about 20 plus years. I attended American Convention, Baptist Convention Church for 15 years prior. I'm not picking on any denominations, but I'd like to know the difference between American Baptist and Southern Baptist. But you also alluded to in your excommunication of possible healing. Excuse me. I want to affirm that healing does go on in that process, although sometimes it's very hard to admit it.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah, it's
Thanks,
certainly
Lucy.
very hard to admit it sometimes. That's true. And in this is a wonderful case. It's a terrible case, but it's a wonderful case in that it's the wife who has now divorced the unfaithful husband with the elders of our church agreement that she had every right biblically to do that. She has read through her repentant, now former husband's letter, and she agrees entirely with it, with what he said in it, and she wants the church to vote in favor of forgiving him. And we think she's right to want that. So it's in that sense, it's a sad situation, but for that kind of sad situation, it's about as happy an ending as you get. To the other question about the difference between the Southern Baptist and the American Baptist churches, the American Baptists were right about slavery being wrong, and the Southern Baptists were wrong about slavery being right. So in 1845, because the denomination that we all were formerly a part of, it was called the Triennial Convention because there was a convention that met every 3 years to support originally Adoniram Judson and then other missionaries that were sent, decided to refuse a missionary candidate from Alabama who owned slaves. The board in Boston just made that decision unilaterally. So they violated all procedure in doing that, but just morally they felt they should. And the Baptists in Alabama were very offended. And so they sent a rallying call around, hey, let's form our own group. And so all the churches in Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia and Florida and Louisiana, and you just keep going. I mean, they all withdrew, and they formed in April of 1845 the Southern Baptist Convention. And obviously the Southern Baptist Convention has reversed its terrible position on slavery and even, formally repented and asked for forgiveness. And
And theologically now, what would be the difference between the SBC
Well, yeah,
and
there's
the
a long story for the last 150 years. So the American Baptist Church...
Short story.
Short. Well, the American Baptist churches were the old Northern Convention, and they changed their name in the 1950s. They are much smaller than the SBC. The North faced a lot of immigration, so areas that had lots and lots of Baptists in them became by now deeply Roman Catholic areas through 19th century waves of immigration from Europe. Baptist churches became small. Baptist churches in the North also tended to be much less theologically careful. They were more open to revising their understanding of the Bible. So many Baptist churches in the North stopped believing that the Bible was the inerrant Word of God. It just started. We went to an American Baptist church for a while when we lived up in Massachusetts, and whereas the Southern churches, partly because just culturally after the Civil War there was no economy, so there were no immigrants coming in because there were no jobs. So the sort of judgment of God on the South, in God's kind grace, also ended up bringing about a cultural conservatism that not only brought us racism, but also brought us a kind of continued faith in the authority of Scripture. So strange bedfellows, but that authority of Scripture, I think, has outlived the racism and continues to attack it and undermine it. But by God's grace, those Southern churches, and now they're completely misnamed now because the American Baptist churches are mainly in the North and on the West Coast, and even the California group just pulled off because of the liberalism in the ABC, whereas the Southern churches are all over the United States. So it's just, there are 1 million American Baptist members, there are 15 or 16 million Southern Baptist members. So it should be called now the Northern Baptist Convention and the American Baptist Convention, but yeah, that's a little short history.
Yes, last question, then we'll wrap up.
Good afternoon. I'm Birch Champion. Kevin and I grew up with Rachel Morris in Warren, Maine.
Oh, you did? Oh, great.
Yeah. My question is, you talked about a member's responsibility to the body and to the pastor. When a member feels that the leadership has violated a biblical principle, what is his responsibility, particularly when false teaching has not occurred, but it's a biblical principle?
Vaguely worded. I guess I would tell the member to go speak to whoever that leader is they feel that has violated that. I would think the member might want to be humble enough to realize that guy might disagree with him. You know, so I've got a member in my church who thinks that we violate a biblical principle every time we nominate somebody to be an elder or deacon who doesn't have a wife and more than one child, because of the way he reads the pastorals.
Sure.
He's a dear brother. He loves Jesus. He's a selfless Christian. But he's wrong on that. Every elder in our church understands he's wrong on that. I think almost every other member in our church understands he's wrong on that. So we'll have unanimous votes for somebody except for Carl. And Carl will say, nay. And then, you know, every 2 or 3 years he'll want to explain why. So we say, feel free, stand up, explain. You know, so Carl says, I think the Bible teaches this, you know. And so he just, brother, it depends on what that biblical principle is, and are you humble enough to be prepared to be disagreed with? And then, if so, Carl can always leave and go to another church if he thinks it's that important, it teaches that, except he will not find a church that teaches that. But I mean, if he had a principle that he could find a church that teaches that,
Okay.
you know, he could go there. So it just depends on what the principle is and how important it is and who else besides you sees the importance of that and would agree it's being violated in that situation.
Okay. Thank you.
Just in wrapping up, practically, what sort of decisions do your elders make and does your congregation make? You would agree that one of the differences between us is how we understand the keys of the kingdom, to whom the keys of discipline, membership have been given to. So you would read Matthew 18, tell it to the church, meaning the assembled congregation. Someone with Presbyterian polity would understand, well, the church can also mean the delegated representatives, and so that would be the board of elders. So there's small but important differences. What things do the elders decide, and what things finally does the congregation decide in your polity?
Yeah. The elders would decide everything, except for taking members in, putting members out, who the officers are, and out of prudence, the budget of the church.
Calling a pastor?
Well, that would be who the officers are. And I guess also fundamental things like something about our identity. So if we wanted to, as a corporation, buy or sell property, if we wanted to change our statement of faith or our church covenant or our constitution, that would have to be a vote of the membership.
Okay.
But even then, the members, as long as everything is healthy, the elder's hand is going to be guiding the members what to do. So the members, we would understand, need to do it, but we will kind of instruct them what to do. The thing is, we want them to understand we're not perfect. You feel free to ask us questions about any of this. We'll take as long as we need to. And we want them to understand that, because there could come a day, it's happened in other churches, where the elders are wrong, and maybe even bad wrong about gospel issues. And at that point, we want the members to be taught to oppose us.
For wrong about gospel issues, right? So Presbyterian Reformed polity is very similar to that. Members need to vote on the budget, need to vote on church officers, except in our polity, their vote is technically advisory on calling the pastor, because it's the classis or the presbytery that does that. So the only difference is the elders handle the membership, receiving and releasing people. But even there, there's a sense of, we want to communicate with the congregation, we want them to understand. And so it probably nets out in similar, though not identical, ways.
It sounds like it.
Mark, before we close, just do some announcements, close with the doxology. Anything else? Any websites, books, information you want people to know about the church? Here's your last shot.
Nah.
Okay, 9marks.org has a lot of good resources.
They know about that if they want to.
Okay, well, now they just heard it again.
I'm not much
He's
into advertising.
hard to work with. Okay.
They'll find it if they want it.